episode of the BioHub. Today, we're thrilled to be joined by Michael Kauffman, who is the president and CEO of Nereid Therapeutics, with over 25 years of experience spanning drug development, regulatory strategy, and biotech leadership. Michael has left an incredible mark on the field of oncology and has held leadership roles at Karyopharm, Onyx Pharmaceuticals, Proteolix, and Millennium Pharmaceuticals, and has contributed to several FDA-approved drugs. Now a CEO of Nereid Therapeutics and a board member for multiple biotech companies, he continues to be at the forefront of driving innovation. So join us today as Michael runs us through his journey, the difference between good drug developers and good scientists, as well as how to get on a board. So Michael, thanks so much for coming on. How are you?
Pleasure to be here, and I'm doing well, thanks.
Good. Awesome. Well, let's dive into it with a little bit about you. So can you tell us about your journey in the biotech field and what inspired you to join Nereid Therapeutics as CEO?
Sure. Well, I'll go through it quickly. It's been a few years. I was an academic physician. I did my training, MD, Ph.D. at Johns Hopkins, and then over to Beth Israel, and then Mass General for rheumatology after internal medicine. I thought I was going to be an academic doctor, but I was recruited heavily to Biogen. It was my first job out of Mass General. I kept my clinic going for a few years until I just got too busy in the company. I cut my teeth on first-in-human studies with a drug for lupus, which is actually finally just had its first phase 3. This is a long time ago, so it can take a long time. But I was long gone after that and went over to Millennium diagnostics company called Millennium Predictive Medicine. We were bought by the parent, and I showed up at the parent company as a vice president of clinical with really not a lot to do, and a drug fell into our lap. And I bring this up because it's very typical of our industry. The first proteasome inhibitor, namely what became Velcade, which we really didn't understand how good it could be. And I was a doctor without a drug, and that was a drug without a physician. So they handed it to me. And the rest is sort of history. We did the first accelerated approval in multiple myeloma, and that drug eventually hit about $2.5 billion in sales, I think in the mid 2000s. So really a wonderful drug that helped transform myeloma from really a death sentence. Most people were dying within 2 years, and now we have patients with all the breakthrough therapies in myeloma. We have patients living 10 and sometimes 15, 20 years. Many of them are achieving a so-called normal lifespan. So that was my first real hit. I then went on to become CEO of a company, brought several drugs into the clinic. The company was called Onyx Pharmaceuticals, which was a super cool computational company. We designed nice small molecule drugs. Ultimately, the first one failed in a couple of depression and anxiety studies. In my opinion, small companies should really try to stay clear of these sorts of studies because they're super hard to do. And even the best drugs we have only win 50 or 60% of the time. And that company eventually went bankrupt, and I had left. I was venture capitalist for a little while, and then on to Proteolix and Onyx, and the approval of Kyprolis, the second proteasome inhibitor for myeloma, hit $1 billion recently. Terrific drug. Actually beat my first child. It went head-to-head against Velcade and won. So I had sort of a fight between the two kids, and the younger one won. And then I went on. My wife started a company called Karyopharm Therapeutics, a first-in-class nuclear export inhibitor. This was started in our house. It was her idea, and we put some of our own money into it, grew the company, got a big Series A, 20 million, and then Series B crossover round. We had responses in the clinic, ultimately leading to a drug called XPOVIO, which is approved in diffuse large B-cell lymphoma and in myeloma. So a really nice set of drugs, mostly for myeloma and lymphoma. And I was pretty much retired and joined a bunch of boards. And I got antsy after about 1.5 years, and I decided I needed to do something else. And I was talking to this company called Nereid Therapeutics, and they had technology based on the newly discovered entities in cells called biomolecular condensates. And this is actually it's like most things in biology. They were always there. For those of you that know some biology, the nucleolus is a condensate. We just didn't call it that. We called it an organelle without a membrane. It turns out there's multiple hundreds of these organelles without membranes in cells, and Nereid had a very focused and unique way of screening for these, technology from Cliff Brangman's lab out of Princeton. And I just thought we were working on some of the toughest targets in oncology, beta-catenin, c-Myc, a very tough target in acute, in ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, TDP-43, and we decided, I decided that this is what I wanted to do. Small 15-person company, very focused. We're funded by Apple Tree Partners, so we have a lot of the corporate functions that are in the parent. And this has allowed us to run a really streamlined operation, and we're hopefully going to be in the clinic this year.
So yeah, so you come from a medical background yourself. What do you think the big differences are between scientists and physicians in terms of how they think, and the big difference between good scientists and good drug developers?
Yeah, it's a super interesting question, and it's as philosophical as it is probably practical. And I think this is a really important distinction. When I was a young nerdy kid, I really wanted to be a doctor. Of course, I didn't really know what that means. Nobody does until they actually get in there and do it. But I love the idea that you could take people that were sick and give them something usually, or do some surgery, and then they were better again. They can go on and live their life. And I think that's one of the great pillars of civilization. And I really did. I love this. But I also realized that the language of science was very different than the language of medicine. And that's why I went to, I applied for the combined MD, Ph.D. programs at a few different universities. I picked Hopkins overall because, frankly, they recruited me the hardest. And they have a great track record, especially in the medical training, excellent research as well, of course, in Baltimore, Maryland. And I think that was a great choice. Turned out the medical training there was incredible as a young aspiring doctor. And it became very clear that these two languages were quite different. Medical doctors have to see a person come in and figure out what's relevant to the current problem. How do we deal with all of the problems together? And thankfully, this is increasing because people are living longer and with more stuff. And so you have to worry about everything now. And that's great progress in medicine. Scientists generally try to reduce problems to a single variable and study those. It's a reductionist approach. So on one hand, you have the holistic approach. The other one, you have a reductionist approach. And the more I thought about it, as I was going through my training, I started to get, even after only a couple of years in actually seeing patients and helping them, was that I was having the same conversation about side effects and the same conversations about the limits of the activity of the current drugs. And this is kind of the string that Biogen pulled when they recruited me out of Mass General, was to say, hey, listen, why would you want to keep doing that when you, especially with your scientific training, could help move medicine forward? And then I got into industry, and to your second point, Tom, what's the difference between a scientist, a doctor, and a drug developer? Well, the drug developer stands somewhere in the middle. Scientists are there to solve problems. They make hypotheses and they solve problems. Saying my problem is to make a drug to fix X is obviously simplistic and easy. But really what you're trying to do is, how do I create a new molecule? Either a small molecule, which means something that weighs less than 500 to 1,000 Daltons, or a large molecule like an antibody or a peptide or a polypeptide or something like that. And the answer is it's somewhere in the middle, because you got to worry about the specific problem you're trying to solve, but you got to do it in the context of a whole human being. And you also have to remember that there's only one relevant species. We're so wrapped up in our animal models and our animal toxicology studies. And one of my favorite comments to remind people is there's only one relevant species, and it only has two legs. Because people really do forget that. And it's very easy to forget that when you're wrapped in. So a drug developer is someone that has a picture of the final product, the drug, that the patient's either going to take a pill or an injection or something, into their veins or under the skin or inhaled or whatever. And that's going to help a whole human being. And the other thing is that it's a little bit like the saying about military actions, is that military plans survive until the first bullet is fired. And that's the same thing. You know, medicines are all great in theory, and they go through our animal models and our animal testing, and they should, because I would never, ever want to put a new entity into a human being as the first living thing that I ever put the entity in. And then stuff happens. And stuff happens because humans are heterogeneous. They have different genetics. They obviously are on all different kinds of medicines. They have different comorbid conditions, meaning other medical problems. And frankly, they're taking a lot of stuff nowadays that they don't even tell you about. There's the old general nutrition store, or the old organics that they take, or natural products and stuff. And they don't, half of them don't think about it as a drug, and the other half are embarrassed by it. So you don't really know what you're doing, and you got to be nimble. And one of the things that I say a lot to our scientists and physicians when we're developing new drugs is to keep your eye on the ball. The ball is, how do we get to that product that's going to go into a human, or on topical on a human? And that's the key. It's easy to say, but you'd be amazed how many times scientists will want to go off and deviate to study a problem. Because in our PhDs, what happened was, you know, we would get a result. It would be a little bit unusual. We'd say, oh, I'm going to study that for a few weeks or a few months. And that's not the goal in drug development. The goal in drug development is, how do I get to that new thing that I'm going to put into people? I think that's why it sits right between scientists and doctors. And the last thing I'll say is that physicians tend to want to get more and more data because humans are so heterogeneous. We don't have time for that. At the beginning of drug development, you know, there's always the first patient, and then there's always the first response or good effect. And then there's the second one and the third one. And a lot of times you'll hear doctors say, well, I need more data. Well, the only way to get more data is to treat more patients. And it becomes a little bit of a chicken and egg problem. So you got to get doctors that are willing to be very risk tolerant. You've got to have your eye on the ball. Of course, you want to protect the patients, you know, from a side effect point of view. But at least in oncology, remember, many of our early patients that come into our study, frankly, have one other alternative, and that's dying of their cancer. That's why people enter early stage cancer drugs. You got to remember, risk reward is in the context of what disease is going on and what disease you're trying to treat.
Good. Yeah, I think that's a really good breakdown that you made there. And this is now your fourth CEO role. So obviously Nereid, you've also been CEO at Karyopharm, Avetix Pharmaceuticals, Predix Pharmaceuticals. What have you, or what would you typically look for in C-level leaders from a hiring standpoint?
Yeah, so one of the things I say to C-level leaders, and I tend to be a very, I mean, I do speak a reasonable amount, but that's usually to set the strategy and try to keep people's eye on the goal line. What I want from my C-level people, especially as the companies get bigger, is that they don't need me to manage them. I do have a saying that if you need management when you're at the C-level, you're not a C-level person. You need a leader. I mean, that's why we have a chief executive officer. But in terms of day-to-day management and style and so on, you better be able to handle things. And the other thing you have to do as a C-level person is you have got to manage up. It is not my job as the CEO to worry about every detail. In fact, I should worry about as few details as possible, because I have trust in my C-level people to bring the important details to me, especially the ones that are going to derail the program. And let's address it, and let's get on top of it as soon as possible. So you really need C-level people who've got their eye down on their team on the ball, and they've got their eye up to the CEO on when do I need to bring them in and help. The other thing you've got to have is you've got to have people, regardless of your CEO style, you've got to be philosophically aligned. And there are lots of different kinds of philosophy in a CEO. I tend to be someone who's much less concerned about employees who are not performing at a high level. I mean, I even say that if an employee is at a B level or a B minus level, I don't want them in the company. And I don't think investors, especially early stage companies, really want those employees in the company. We want A and A minus. We'd all, of course, want A plus employees all the time, but there aren't enough. And at that level, a lot of it comes down to sort of really detailed stuff that's frankly not important. What I want are employees and C-level people that are aligned philosophically, because at the end of the day, if they're going to be complaining about you, you know, they should leave. There's just no C-level as well as employees. If you're not philosophically aligned, if you don't share the vision of the company, especially in a small company, you don't belong there. Go find somebody that you agree with. I think that's increasingly important nowadays, because this notion that we all can sort of sit around and have a meshed or you know, a compromise on philosophy is absurd. It really, you can't run a company if you're not, especially a small one, if you're not aligned.
Yeah, good. And I think just like the general biotech market at the moment is interesting. Maybe companies a few years ago that could go out and raise rounds are now struggling to go out and raise funds. You've also had experience on the venture capital side. What do you think investors are really looking for in companies, particularly at the moment when the market is the way it is?
Yeah, I think, look, the first thing you have to recognize now is that when the market goes south, the first thing investors have to do to protect their early investments is to make sure that their early investments are funded. So one of the problems with the market and it is crashing. I mean, it's another nuclear winter. We go through sort of manic summers in biotech, and we go through nuclear winters. And every time we have a nuclear winter, it seems like worse than the last one. And we're in a tough one. And the reason we're in a tough one is because we had too many companies 4 or 5 years ago, and too many C-level teams put together, and too many good ideas that weren't great ideas. And now we've got to try to figure out which ones, or the investors have to figure out which ones are going to go bankrupt, and which or return money to their shareholders and close, and which ones that they are going to have to fund. And the fundamental problem right now is that you've got very difficult decisions going on by the investors saying, how are we going to bridge this company to an eventual funding round or to a value creating milestone? And so they don't have a lot of mind space nor free cash, frankly, that they want to invest in new companies. So that's the problem. You had a number of venture funds that have closed. You got a lot of turnover and so on. So it's a trickle, you know, it really is trickled down in our industry. Until big pharma starts buying more biotech, or there are more drug approvals leading to revenue generating companies, and frankly self-sustainable, most of those would of course be public companies, it's going to be a tough road. And like all of these kind of downturns, it will come back up. I mean, it's standard economics. It just seems more acute and more vertical, if you will, down, and then it'll be a slower climb up in this round. So that is the major problem with investors. I think investors are also looking for products now that are north, that have the potential at least to sell north of $500 million to $1 billion. And I've had a couple of my companies that have had very good interactions with investors that eventually pulled out because they said, this is probably only a $600 million opportunity, and I need $1 billion. I've had other investors say, hey, it's a $600 million opportunity, we're in. For sure, but that is increasingly. It's interesting because I don't think pharma in general is so wedded anymore to the so-called blockbuster only drugs. I mean, the low-hanging fruit, and this is great for patients, great for medicine. The low-hanging fruit in medicine is really gone. I mean, if you think about some of the multi-billion-dollar products that are mainstays now of therapy, the statins, the add-on drugs to statins, the antihypertensive drugs, you know, really good drugs like the ACE inhibitors and the receptor blockers and so on, angiotensin receptor blockers. And you know, on the other side of things, now we have the GLP-1 analogs and all this kind of stuff. Really much better drugs than we used to have. So the bar is higher. And there's a lot of these big markets that are gone. I mean, I don't think any of us believe we need a drug. We really need a drug to help people with reflux disease anymore, because frankly, the proton pump inhibitors have revolutionized that to the point where those drugs are over the counter. And that multi-billion-dollar market is gone, which is great. So there's an increasing number of medical conditions that are well served that there's really no way to get to. And I would say on the hematologic cancer side, it's a similar problem in the sense that, of course, people are still dying of various hematologic cancers, particularly AML, a little bit ALL, but mostly acute myeloid leukemia, and much less common in the US, Burkitt's lymphoma. But most of the other hematologic cancers are well served, myeloma being a poster child for that, but chronic lymphocytic leukemia and follicular lymphoma and so on. So those markets are gone, essentially. And if you want to be an add-on, you're talking probably about a several $100 million product. And lastly, I would say that in oncology, at least, investors therefore would be looking primarily at the big solid tumors, the big 5 or 6 solid tumors, the colons, prostates, breast, lung, ovarian, and pancreatic, and so on. To some extent, bladder now, because it's treated, so there are more patients. So I think that's what's driving a lot of this, Tom.
Okay, interesting. And in terms of your background again, so you currently sit on 6 boards. What advice would you give to people that are wanting to start taking on board roles that maybe don't currently sit on any?
Sure. I think that the main thing, look, the first board is always the most difficult. I like to say sometimes it's like when you're dating and you have your first girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever. It's always the toughest one. And once you break into it, it's much easier, because the way many people look for board members is they look at other companies that have board members and contact those board members. So you have to get in the game. And first thing you have to do is not take it seriously, is the wrong word, but you can't take it personally. You got to plan that it's going to take 1 to 2 years in general, I think, to get onto a board. My first board role was a long time ago. I think it was 2002 or 3. I was on a board called BioEnvision, and people heard that I was a good drug developer. I had helped usher Velcade, led the Velcade team, ushering into the first accelerated approval, and I was, good background and so on. So this little company, BioEnvision, said, we want this guy to help us figure out if this drug is real, if there's really a market here, and if the team is really focused as much as they can be on driving towards approval, as opposed to some nice to haves. And it was a very good board. We eventually sold the company to Genzyme, did nicely, and that was my first role, and that helped me get other roles. To break in, what you really should try to do is to meet as many headhunters like Tom on the phone and other folks that look for board, high-level board headhunters. The C-level and board, they tend to go together, and you've got to talk to 3 or 4 of them and get on their radar. And you've got to be proactive about it, and you figure out a way to get introduced to them through friends, through LinkedIn, through whatever. But don't stop, and don't get discouraged, because everything takes time, especially these days. And they also come in globs. I mean, it's funny when I look back. I would have 2 or 3 years where nobody would contact me, and then I would get 3 board offers in a row, or 3 companies that came to me and said, "Do you have room for another board?" When I retired from Karyopharm several years ago, and my plan was to add a couple of boards, and I would have liked to snap my fingers and have that happen, but I had to go reach out to the people that knew me and let them know I was available for 2 or 3 more boards, and it took 9 or 10 months before that process went, and I was a guy that was already on 3 boards. So people knew me and had a good track record. So that's what I would say to people. The best way to do this is LinkedIn, to meet the headhunters, get your name out there, explain why you could bring something unique to a board. And by the way, don't be shy about being a first-time board member. I'm chairman of several of the boards that I'm on, and I smile a lot when the new board members come on and say, "Hey, do you mind having a quick discussion with me about what you expect from me on the board?" And frankly, what I expect from people on the board is know your stuff and speak up when you have something important to say. Your job is not to run the company, and this is the toughest part. Your job is not to run the company. Your job is to give advice and to make sure that when the company is going off the rails, that you bring it up at the board and let us discuss it so we can help put the company back on the roll. But don't worry about all the pomp and circumstance. Some of them are particularly worried about the legal issues around being a board member. I said, we've got a lawyer in the room all the time. None of us are going to let you go off the rails. You're not being brought in to know the legal aspects of being a board member. You're being brought in for your subject matter expertise and your gestalt, your gut feel to drive value creation in the company.
Yeah, awesome. And this is a question that we always finish with on the BioHub. If you were to have dinner with 3 people, past or present, who would they be and why? They don't necessarily need to be innovators unless you'd like them to be, but yeah, 3 people for dinner, who would they be and why?
Well, I strongly believe that philosophy underscores everything we do. Even if you don't know what your philosophy is, when we're, especially in our industry, but increasingly in modern life, where we encounter novel circumstances all the time, and it's impossible to go and look at your past experience in that situation, because that situation didn't exist before, and figure it out. So you need some kind of fundamental philosophy. From a young age, I was wedded to Objectivism by Ayn Rand, a bit of a iconoclastic Russian woman who emigrated to Hollywood, of all places, and immigrated to Hollywood and wrote screenplays, and then became one of the preeminent 20th century and now relevant, especially to the 21st century philosophers that really supported America as an ideal, the notions of Western thought, life, liberty, property rights, and the pursuit of happiness. And Objectivism, as the name would indicate, is really relevant to science and medicine, because if we're not objective, we're going to lose. I mean, patients are going to die or they're going to suffer, and that's not acceptable. So that when I first picked up the Fountainhead, I was pretty much wedded to it, and that was multiple decades ago. So I would definitely want to have dinner with Ms. Rand. She smoked a lot, so I'd have to probably be outside for that, because I don't think I could tell her not to smoke. She'd probably slap me. Tough woman. If you've ever seen her interviews, she didn't hold back any punches. I mean, she's a tough but very brilliant. I think, frankly, one of the geniuses of philosophy. So she would be number 1. And the next 2 are pretty obvious. The second one is a guy that struggled, and I was an early Macintosh adopter way before it overtook Microsoft, and everybody understood that your goal was not to learn how to use a computer. Your goal should be to just use the computer. And Steve Jobs had that vision from the get-go, which was, I want to make something that people love to use, not people that have to learn how to go C // for those of you who remember all that kind of programming language, semi-programming language stuff. So Steve Jobs definitely. Also, remember, Steve had a brutal time. He grew Apple. It almost went bankrupt. He got fired from it. He had to take a loan from Microsoft. He got brought back. It went through terrible times. He did Pixar. The man was absolutely relentless, and it's such a great thing to read his. Walter Isaacson has a wonderful biography of him, and young people should all read that, because the notion that he suddenly thought of Apple and it just went from A to Z, amazingly. Wow. I mean, he got knocked down so many times, and he got up and did better, and always rose to the challenge. Now with the preeminent platform, I think, for personal computing, and to a larger and larger extent, even in business. And then the last person is another obvious person, because I love innovators. The way you move humanity forward is you innovate. Well, I sort of have 2. So the obvious one is Elon Musk, and I won't go into that, because I think Elon has created some of the most important companies, and he's going to continue. He's continuing to, and so on. And the rescue of the 2 astronauts with this remarkable rocket ship that came back to Earth and landed on its own, by the way, if you saw that, without any kind of catchment either. It just got itself vertical and landed on its base on its own. Was terrific. But I think I would probably pick a MD PhD, the pioneer of immunology and cancer. That is the first guy to really realize in a big way that the only way we were going to cure people with metastatic cancer, we only had a shot, was to get the immune system involved. And the guy from Brooklyn, I think Brooklyn, New York, but definitely New York City, Steven Rosenberg, who's still in his 80s, I believe, running his lab at the NIH, seeing patients. And this guy is a powerhouse, and he was so far ahead of his time. We've only begun to scratch the surface now. We are curing a small percentage, but we're curing people with metastatic cancer, and that is something I would love to see more of in my lifetime. But the fact that we're seeing any of it is, I think, was started by Steve Rosenberg, who just really did an amazing pioneering job there. So definitely talking to him.
Good. Well, look, I think there's three terrific answers there, and I think your contribution experience in the oncology field has just been remarkable and inspiring to listen to. So it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on, Michael, and yeah, look forward to keeping in touch.
Thanks very much.
Enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
Cheers.